When it comes to adoption, the concept is quite familiar to most, with 6 out of 10 Americans having a personal experience with it. The number of Americans aware of this process is significant, yet there continues to be an utter ignorance for one of the most important groups in the entire process, the birth mothers. The relinquishment of a child is oftentimes traumatic when the proper support is not provided, which can eventually lead to long-term emotional and mental consequences that are expected to be dealt with in isolation and shame. Because of those dangers, it's important to bring awareness to the raw and painful experience of birth mothers post-placement. In order to fully understand the experience of a birth mother post-adoption, it is crucial to analyze why a woman may choose to relinquish her child in the first place. The most common reason found amongst mothers in these situations is that they could not adequately provide for the child, many saying that they could not even take care of themselves. In addition to insufficient finances, a lack of preparation for motherhood was another constant variable amongst birth mothers, with several of them feeling ashamed for being single and were convinced that the child deserved 2 parents. By not feeling capable of motherhood by simply being single, some women feel powerless when the time comes to make the decision to adopt. One of the mothers interviewed in a study conducted by Lisa Cron and Richard Sullivan demonstrates this helplessness, stating that it wasn't an issue of not loving her. I knew I could love her. I knew I could try my best, but I just didn't think my best could ever be good enough. This sentiment regarding adoption has the right intentions when it comes to the well-being of the child. However, for the mother, it establishes a toxic mentality where she diminishes her credibility as an adequate caretaker based on this single decision. While this depreciation of self-worth may seem insignificant in the grand scheme of the adoption process, it can evolve into later feelings of regret for the initial decision, regardless if it was the right choice given the circumstances at the time. Although these may not be all the reasons why a woman may choose to relinquish her child, with some women often feeling empowered by their decision, the aforementioned aid in truly understanding the circumstances of the birth mothers prepartum and how those factors shape their negative experiences afterward. Upon the relinquishment of her child, a birth mother most commonly endures the emotional experience of separation grief. According to Cliff Picton, a lecturer in social work, all 18 birth mothers in his study reported the signing of the adoption papers as being traumatic, leaving the woman with a feeling of numbness and disassociation during the hospitalization. In both open and closed adoptions, mothers felt that this major decision in their lives was conducted without any regard for their emotions and feelings, illustrating a common belief that they are simply a nuisance in the adoption process. Because of this, their disregard soon amplifies feelings of guilt and grief, transforming their relinquishment into complete and continuing agony that many compare to the separation of a child through death. The loss is irrevocable in terms of relationship. Many of the women left the hospital with more uncertainty and anxiety than when they first walked in, with lingering questions regarding what family the baby ended up with, if the adoptive parents were capable, and if the baby was in good health. These doubts are completely valid to have post-adoption, but the repeated unwillingness to ease these doubts clearly indicates a major flaw in the current system in place. Birth mothers feel as if they are undeserving of answers due to the preconceived notion that any negative emotions they feel afterward are brought upon by themselves, and they must suffer the consequences. The separation grief continues to worsen even after the initial loss of contact with the baby, with various birth mothers experience strong waves of loneliness, as there definitely seemed to be an emptiness when they are no longer there. Everyone kind of takes a step backward, making the loneliness even worse. Unfortunately, these are not standalone experiences, and further demonstrate how such a robotic, isolating process does not numb the pain of child separation, but instead creates a deeper pain that becomes extremely difficult to recover from. The emotional toll separation grief takes on birth mothers is too severe to be continually swept under the rug, yet this grief often goes unresolved due to a larger societal issue. While separation grief is reported to be common amongst many birth mothers, it often goes unresolved due to the societal marginalization these mothers constantly face. When it comes to the painstaking grief they experience, not only must they struggle to cope with it, they are told they must struggle in silence. Society has crafted a narrative that natural mothers are selfish for giving away their child, and that they should simply forget about their relinquishment and move on, and believe that pushing the feelings and emotions that come with placing her child through adoption is the right thing to do. This therefore invalidates all the negative emotions a birth mother may have postpartum, eventually making her grief internalized and more harmful to her mental and psychological state. This invalidation creates an emotional void in these women's lives, one that will continue to get worse as long as society refuses to acknowledge their pain collectively. Many birth mothers are often given the normalized, yet harmful, advice to merely act as if the pregnancy never occurred. This socially acceptable denial is a completely unhealthy way to deal with separation grief. It further reinforces birth mothers' guilt and deteriorating self-worth by inherently stating that relinquishing their child is such an unspeakable act that it must be forgotten about completely. Without the proper support for their grief, these mothers begin to develop psychological issues that have long-term effects. Due to the staggering marginalization and emotional distress birth mothers endure, psychological triggers become prevalent in their lives postpartum. These triggers can vary immensely between natural mothers, however, they all originate from their internalized emotions and ignored needs post-adoption. One of the most common psychological triggers that develop is an anniversary reaction, in which the birth mothers experience severe waves of sadness and mourning on the yearly anniversary of the relinquishment of their child, or parent-based holidays such as Mother's Day. Many mothers reminisce about the final moments before their child was taken away by adoption officials, often wondering what their lives would look like if they chose the opposing decision. Often, these hypotheticals tend to resurface repressed guilt and regret, even if the birth mothers know that their initial decision was the correct one. Having serious doubts about a preeminent life decision is not something completely self-made. Like many other decisions, the surrounding environment plays a significant role, and the fact that these women are experiencing feelings of regret for an immensely brave choice clearly proves that the adoption community is one filled with painful alienation instead of support. Another major trigger these mothers tend to develop is an emotional inability to have a child following the initial adoption. The physical trauma from giving birth the first time triggers a flight response in these women, thus making it even more difficult to truly recover and move on from their negative post-adoption experience. A trigger that occurs more frequently involves birth mothers subconsciously looking at every child on the street that would be around the same age as their own child, in hopes of finding them again. This trigger invokes much more loss than hope, as every child reminds them of a part of themselves is missing. Instead of feeling as if they successfully built a new family for the child, the culture amongst the adoption community makes these mothers feel as if all they did was destroy themselves. By exploring the harsh reality of birth mothers in the adoption process, these women can finally earn a voice in a community where their silence was once expected. The disregard for the severe effects of relinquishment is so beneath acceptable that support must be guaranteed at this point. By continuing to dismiss the experience of birth mothers in the adoption community and consequently suppress the proper support these women need, more expectant mothers falsely believe that adoption is a morally unconscionable decision because giving one's child is wrong. This perspective promotes society's bias towards biological relations, where in the case of birth mothers, relinquishing a biological tie is wrong because it is believed to be stronger than those of possible adoptive parents. Not only is this view outdated, but it is also harmful, as it fosters a substantial amount of guilt for these mothers who have done nothing to deserve it. Awareness of the experience, regardless of how disheartening or alarming it may seem, will allow this vital part of the adoption community to be properly taken care of, ultimately empowering a once voiceless group that has been oppressed for far too long. In identifying the multitude of factors that shape the painful post-adoption experience, such as separation grief and societal pressures, as well as psychological triggers, there is sufficient research to successfully give these women a proper platform to request the support they desperately need and stop the marginalization they constantly face. As seen with all the provided evidence, dealing with such a significant experience alone is daunting. It has a catastrophic domino effect, which too often can lead to extremely dangerous circumstances, such as suicidal thoughts and depression. By giving a voice to these women, this domino effect can finally cease to exist, and the adoption system can become one about equality instead of disparity.